it's up for you to believe the hype or not. Ukraine now the war with Ukraine is rapidly becoming another war that's fucking gone wrong. Now NATO keeps pouring money and more and into more expensive hardware and hoping to drive Putin from power, but it's being nothing more than a bloody stalemate. Now now if you look at empires in terminal decline, they leap from one military fiasco to the next. Now the war in Ukraine, another bungled attempt to reassert U.S. global um now I'm not sure if I'm going to say this word right, hegemony, and it fits this pattern. The danger is that the more dire things look, the more the U.S. will escalate the conflict, potentially provoking open confrontation with Russia. Now, Russia carries out retaliatory attacks on supply and training bases in neighboring NATO countries, and they use tactical nuclear weapons. Now, NATO will almost certainly respond by attacking Russian forces, but then it will ignite World War III, which could result in a nuclear holocaust. Um, U.S. military support for Ukraine began with the basics: ammunition and assault weapons. The Biden administration, however, soon crossed several self-imposed red lines to provide a tidal wave of lethal war machinery. Now, the Stinger anti-aircraft systems, the Javelin anti-armor systems, the M777 towed howitzers, the 122 Grad rockets, the M142 multiple rocket launchers or HIMARS, the tube-launched optically tracked wire-guided TOW missiles, the Patriot air defense batteries, the National Advanced Service to Air Missile Systems, the M113 armored personal carriers, and now the 31 M1 Abrams as part of a new $400 million package for NATO and for the military. These tanks will be supplemented by 14 German Leopard 2A6 tanks, 14 British Challenger 2 tanks, and tanks from other NATO members, including Poland. Um, Next on the list are armor-piercing depleted uranium ammunition and F-15 and F-16 fighter jets. Now, since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th of 2022, Congress has approved more than $113 billion in aid to Ukraine and allied nations supporting the war for Ukraine. Um, now, three-fifths of this aid, which is $67 billion, has been allocated for military expenditures. Now, there are 28 countries transferring weapons to Ukraine, and all of them, with the exception of Australia, Canada, and the U.S., are all located in Europe. Now, the rapid upgrade of sophisticated military hardware and aid provided to Ukraine is not a good sign for the NATO alliance. It takes many months, if not years, of training to operate and coordinate these weapon systems. Now, the tank battles, like the last major tank battle outside Kuwait City during the first Gulf War as a reporter, are highly choreographed and complex operations. The armor must work in close concert with air power, warships, infantry, and artillery batteries. It will be many months, if not years, before Ukrainian forces receive adequate training to operate this type of equipment and coordinate the diverse components of a modern battlefield. Now, indeed, the U.S. never succeeded in training the Iraqi and Afghan armies in combined arms in the maneuver type of warfare, despite 2 decades of occupation. Um, Now, Chris Hedges basically was with the Marine Corps unit back in February of 1991, and he was part of the one that pushed Iraqi forces out of the Saudi Arabian town of Khafji. Now, supplied with superior military equipment, the Saudi Arabian soldiers that held Khafji offered effectual resistance. As he entered the city, he saw Saudi Arabian troops in commandeered fire trucks hightailing itself to rescue the fighting, or to escape the fighting. Now, all the fancy military hardware which the Saudis had purchased from the U.S. proved worthless because they didn't know how to use it. Now, NATO military commanders understood that the infusion of these weapon systems into the war will not alter what it was, at best, but it will become a stalemate and defined largely by artillery duels over hundreds of miles of front lines. The purchase of these weapon systems, one M1 Abrams tank costs $10 million when training and sustainment are included. Now, it increases the profits of the arms manufacturers, but the use of these weapons in Ukraine allows them to be tested in battlefield conditions, making the war a laboratory for weapons manufacturers such as the Lockheed Martin. All of this is useful to NATO and to the arms industry, but it's not very useful to Ukraine if they don't know how to fucking use it. Now, the other problem with advanced weapon systems such as the M1 Abrams, which has a 1,500 horsepower turbine engine that runs on jet fuel, is that they are temperamental and they require highly skilled and near constant maintenance. And they are not forgiving to those operating them who make mistakes. Indeed, mistakes can be fucking lethal, but the most optimistic scenario for deploying an M1 Abrams tank in Ukraine is 6 to 8 months, and more likely longer than that. If Russia launches a major offensive in the spring as expected, the M1 Abrams will not be part of the Ukrainian arsenal. Even when they do arrive, they will not significantly alter the balance of power, especially if the Russians are able to turn the tanks, and they are manned by inexperienced crews and into charred hulks. So why all this infusion of high-tech weaponry? Can we sum it up in one word? Fucking panic, basically. And having declared a de facto war on Russia and openly calling for the removal of Vladimir Putin, the neoconservative pimps of war, watch with dread as Ukraine is being pummeled by a relentless Russian war of attrition. Ukraine has suffered nearly 18,000 civilian casualties, 6,919 killed, and 11,075 people injured. It has also seen around 8% of its total housing destroyed or damaged and 50% of its energy infrastructure directly impacted with frequent power cuts. Ukraine requires at least $3 billion a month in outside support to keep its economy afloat, and the International Monetary Fund's managing director recently said nearly 14 million Ukrainians have been displaced, 8 million people in Europe and 6 million internally, and up to 18 million people in general, which is 40% of Ukraine's population, and it will soon require humanitarian assistance. Now, Ukraine's economy contracted by 35% in 2022, and 60% of Ukrainians are now poised to live on less than $5 million a day. According to the World Bank estimates, 9 million Ukrainians right now are without electricity and war in sub-zero temperatures. According to estimates from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, at least 100,000 Ukrainian and 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured in the war as of last November. Now, my feeling here is we're at a crucial moment in the conflict when the momentum could shift in favor of Russia if we don't act decisively and quickly, said former Senator Rob Portman, who was quoted as saying at the World Economic Forum in a post by the Atlantic Council, a surge is going to be needed. Turning logic on its head, and the shows for war argue that the greatest nuclear threat we face is a Russian victory. The cavalier attitude to a potential nuclear confrontation with Russia by the cheerleaders for the war in Ukraine is very, very frightening, especially given the fiascos that they oversaw for 20 years in the Middle East. The near historical calls to support Ukraine as a bulwark of liberty and democracy by the mandarins in Washington are a response to the palpable rot and decline of the U.S. empire. America's global authority has been decimated by well-publicized war crimes, torture, economic decline, social disintegration, including the assault on the Capitol, including the Klan attack assault on the Capitol on January 6th of 2021, the botched response to the pandemic by Trump, declining life expectancies, and the plague of mass shootings that were encouraged by Trump, and a series of military debacles from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Now, the coup, the political assassinations, the non-existent voter fraud, the black propaganda, the blackmail, the kidnapping, the brutal counterinsurgency campaigns, the U.S. sanctioned massacres, torture and global black sites, the proxy war, and military interventions carried out by the United States around the globe since the end of World War II have never resulted in the establishment of a democratic government, but instead these interventions have led to over 20 million people being killed, and it spawned a global revulsion for the U.S. imperialism. Now, in desperation, the empire pumps ever greater sums into its war machine. The most recent one was a $1.7 trillion spending bill, which included $847 billion for the military. The total is boosted to $858 billion when factoring in accounts that don't fall under the Armed Services Committee's jurisdiction, such as the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy oversees nuclear weapons maintenance and the infrastructure that develops them. In 2021, when the U.S. had a military budget of $801 billion, it constituted nearly 40% of all global military expenditures, more than the next 9 countries, including Russia and China, spent on their militaries combined. Edward Gibbon observed about the Roman Empire's own fatal lust for endless war, the decline of Rome was the nature and inevitable effect of greatness. The prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The cause of the destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest, and as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. Now the story of the ruin is simple and obvious, and instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted for so long. A statement of permanent war creates complex bureaucracies, and it's sustained by a compliant politician, journalists, scientists, technocrats, and academics, who obsequiously serve the war machine. This militarism needs mortal enemies, and the latest are Russia and China. Even when those demonized have no intention or capability, as with the case with Iraq, of harming the U.S., we are hostage to these what they call institutional structures. Now, earlier this month, the House and Senate Armed Services Committee, for example, appointed 8 commissioners to review Biden's national defense strategy, to examine the assumptions, the objectives, the defensive investments, the force posture and structure, operational concepts, and military risks of the NDS. The commission, as Eli Clifton writes at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, is largely comprised of individuals with financial ties to the weapons industry and the U.S. government contractors, raising questions about whether the commission will take a critical eye to contractors who received $400 billion of the $858 billion of the $858 billion of the FY 2023 defense budget. The chair of the commission, Clifton notes, is former California Congresswoman Jane Harman, who sits on the board for Iridium Communications, which is a satellite communications firm that was awarded a 7-year, $738.5 million contract, with the Department of Defense in 2019. Now, reports about Russia interference in the elections and Russian bots manipulating public opinion, which Matt Taibbi's recent reporting on the Twitter files exposes an elaborate piece of black propaganda, and it was uncritically amplified by the press. It seduced Democrats and their Democratic supporters into seeing Russia as a mortal enemy. The near universal support for a prolonged war with Ukraine would not be possible without this fucking type of con. Now, America's 2 ruling parties depend on campaign funds from the war industry and are pressured by weapons manufacturers in their states or districts, who employ constituents to pass gargantuan military budgets. Now, the politicians are acutely aware that to challenge the permanent war economy is to be attacked as an unpatriotic and is usually an act of political suicide. The soul that is enslaved to war cries out for deliverance. This is what Simone Weil writes in her essay. The Iliad are the poem of force, but deliverance itself appears to be an extreme and tragic aspect, and the aspect of destruction. Historians referred to the quixotic attempt by empires in decline to regain a lost hegemony, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, through military adventurism as micro-militarism. Now during the not sure if I'm saying this word right either, the Peloponnesian War, which was an actual 27-year war. The Athenians invaded Sicily, losing 200 ships and thousands of soldiers. The defeat ignited a series of successful revolts throughout the Athenian Empire. The Roman Empire, which at its height lasted for 2 centuries, became captive to its army that, similar to the U.S. war industry, was a state within a state. Rome's once mighty legions in the late stage of their empire suffered defeat after defeat while extracting ever more resources from a crumbling and impoverished state. Now, in the end, the elite Praetorian Guard auctioned off the emperorship to the highest bidder. The British Empire, already decimated by the suicidal military folly of World War I, breathed its last gasp in 1956 when it attacked Egypt in a dispute over the nationalization of the Suez Canal. Britain withdrew in humiliation, and it became an appendage of the United States. A decade-long war in Afghanistan sealed the fate of a decrepit Soviet Union. Now with rising empires, they're often Jewish, um, judicious, even rational in their application of armed forces for conquest and control of overseas dominions. Fading empires are inclined, or their ill-considered display of power, dreaming of bold military masterstrokes that would somehow recoup the lost prestige and power. Um, The historian Alfred McCoy writes in his book In the Shadows of the American Century, The Rise and Decline of U.S. Global Power, and it's often irrational, even from an imperial point of view, that these micro-military operations can yield hemorrhaging the expenditure of humiliating defeats that only accelerate the process already underway. The plan to reshape Europe and the global balance of power by degrading Russia is turning out to resemble the failed plan to reshape the Middle East. It is fueling a global food crisis and it's devastating Europe with near double-digit inflation. It is exposing the impotency once again of the United States and the bankruptcy of its ruling oligarchs. As a counterweight to the U.S., nations such as China, Russia, India, Brazil, and Iran, they are severing themselves from the tyranny of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. It's a move that will trigger economic and social catastrophe in the United States if they follow through with that. Washington has given Ukraine ever more sophisticated weapon systems and billions upon billions of dollars in aid in a futile bid to save Ukraine, but more importantly to save itself. If you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you think. Also, if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way. And thanks for listening.